Hello, I'm Rick Wiggins. I'm a radiologist at the University of Utah, and I'm your guest moderator for today. Dr. Yoshimi Anzai unfortunately couldn't be here. She asked me to fill in for her. So I will be attempting to moderate grand rounds for the Department of Radiology today. Dr. Anzai's chosen speaker is Dr. Nick Koontz from Indiana, who is a rising star in both head and neck imaging and medical education. CME credit is very important. If you want to call in for the CME credit today, you can call that number, 801-478-5852. The secret code for today is 34230. CME credit is very important. We want everybody to apply for continuing medical education credit. We're very lucky to have Dr. Koontz speak with us today. Dr. Koontz is a rising star in both neuroradiology and head and neck imaging and technology and education and medical education. Dr. Koontz is an associate professor at Indiana University, where he also serves as the director of radiology fellowship programs in the Dean D.T. Maglenti Scholar in Radiology Education. Dr. Koontz did all of his undergrad and medical school and radiology residency at Indiana and came to the University of Utah and finished a 2-year neuro fellowship in 2015. We're very excited to hear about his education and efforts. And he's one of the people who's really been widely published and experienced in both of these areas. Just this morning at Tumor Board, I had a case that we diverted from surgery towards follow-up based on Dr. Koontz's work and the importance of ADC as a rough marker of tumor cellularity. And increasingly, we talk more and more about technology and education and how we can use things like social media and YouTube, archivable content. He's also published in technology and education field and talked some about edutainment and the gamification of education, and is really going to be leading the future of technology and education for us. But it's important not only to think about how to educate our students, but for us, especially in the academic world, how do we define that educational efforts in social media in terms of our own retention and promotion and academic credit and how we do that? So Dr. Koontz is going to talk to us for our grand rounds today about that. How do we transform technology and education efforts into academic credit and points? So I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Koontz, and then we'll have a QA session after the talk.
All right. Well, thank you, Rick, for that kind invitation to speak, and to Yoshimi for the kind invitation to come back and give this talk. So as Rick said, I'm going to be talking about transforming education into scholarship. And that's sort of a bit of a nebulous topic, it seems, but we'll kind of march our way through it and talk about really what's been my experience with doing this over the last, better part of a decade at this point. So I've noted financial disclosures to make. I do need to let everyone know up front that I literally have no clue what I'm talking about. I've never taken an education class in my life. I certainly did not go to a prestigious college, but I have learned a few things over the years. I've had lots of great teachers, some of whom are on this Zoom today, great mentors as well, also on this Zoom. And importantly, I've made a lot of mistakes. There's probably no better way to learn than to make mistakes. And so learn from the mistakes of others. That's always the best way to learn. But really, this has just sort of been something that I've, for the large part, figured out as I've gone along. This has been my pathway to doing this, for what it's worth. Kind of as a quote from one of my favorite movies, that I feel like this is most of our careers in academic medicine, is you don't really know what you're doing. You just kind of are making it up as you go along, and you figure out what works and kind of keep going with it. So I want to start with this quote that I found years ago it was actually one of my colleagues here at IU, Richard Gunnerman. And he said in a paper several years ago that the moment that the wheels of radiologic research stop turning, radiology begins to become irrelevant and obsolete. And I think that applies not just to, the basic sciencey kind of research, the clinical research, but also educational research. And that's something that I've sort of have used as a little bit of a mantra during my career so far. So my goals in this talk are, first of all, to talk about just a broad overview of radiology education research. And in doing so, talk you through the process that I use to go from an idea all the way from its conception to the end game, which for those of you that are in academics really should be publication, because nothing matters more for your promotion and tenure, it seems, than publications. Okay, that's sort of the coin of the realm. I'll talk about some past examples, things that I've done, different sorts of education publications, things that have worked, things that haven't worked, which is always an odd thing to talk about. Sort of walking that fine line of talking about your experiences and sharing with others, and then not trying to sound like some giant self-promoting slob, but it's really what I know. This is the path that I've walked, and I can kind of share from those that experiential things that I've gained from that, and then drop some pearls of unsolicited advice along the way. So the first question to start it all off is why? Why should I care? Why should you care about radiology education scholarship? If you're a resident sitting in this conference room, you're not going up for promotion and tenure in the immediate future. Why should you care about this? And the answer is you should. So there are reasons. The first, and they can be broken up into three main categories. The first are the legalistic reasons. And the big thing under that is accreditation. Whether you're a faculty member working in a place that's got a residency program or a fellowship program, whether you're a resident in that training program, the ACGME actually mandates that scholarly activity needs to be going on. All residents, all trainees have to be engaged in some sort of scholarly activity, and you have to have faculty on staff that are doing research and scholarly activities. There are also very egoistic reasons for doing this, okay? These are your self-centered reasons, things like career advancement. If you're a junior faculty member, this means a whole lot to you. But whether or not you're in academic radiology, whether you're in private practice, job satisfaction is important. And so a lot of this will help to distill down to whether or not you are happy with your work environment. And research, even education research, is going to improve your clinical expertise. And then the last part of this is the altruistic reasons. We all should care about this profession of radiology. We should all want to advance it, and we should all want to improve the quality of the educational process, because your education doesn't just end the moment you walk out of the doors as a graduate of a residency program. It is a career of lifelong learning. So in terms of the ACGME, I'm not going to read this to you. Trust me, it's in there. If you look at the common program requirements, whether it's for an ACGME residency or ACGME accredited fellowships, they all have requirements for scholarship by the learners and scholarship by the faculty. So in order to be a citizen in good standing or a program in good standing, you have to have research and scholarly activity going on. For career advancement, I know that it is like the boom times for radiology right now. If you have a pulse and you've graduated radiology residency, there's a job for you. There's probably a dozen jobs for you out there right now, but it's cyclical. I can tell you that not that long ago, when I was graduating fellowship, there were literally 3 academic neuroradiology jobs posted that year for all of the United States. Okay. Things are cyclical. It's a boom time now, but the pendulum is going to swing back. So eventually we will get back to a cutthroat hiring perception, and maybe padding your CV with some research as a resident is not a bad thing to be doing. Even if you're in private practice or interested in going into private practice, the fact that you can demonstrate that you've had some aptitude in these areas outside of just clinical work shows that you're a versatile person. And it shows a future employer that you're somebody that can do more than just the one job that you're focused on doing. And that actually bodes well for you as a candidate. And then there are reasons, of those who are in academic radiology are interested in this for career advancement. I went up for promotion and tenure a couple of years ago. This certainly was on the foremost of my mind at that time. And there are probably folks in the audience that are in that same pathway right now. And again, sort of that versatility. If you're somebody that can show that you are bringing value to your department in more than just the clinical realm, but also in tripartite missions of education and research, that behooves you for career advancement. About job satisfaction, there was a survey that was published several years ago in academic radiology, and they found that about a third of radiologists who they surveyed switched from academic radiology into private practice. And the biggest reason that they cited, or one of the biggest reasons, was difficulty with research. They just weren't trained to do it. They didn't know how to do it. And only about a fourth were satisfied with their prior research activities. And then in terms of clinical expertise, if you have some underlying research background, whether that's in clinical research or educational research, it's actually quite complementary to your skill set as a practicing radiologist. You understand learning methodologies better. You know how to apply data better. You become much more familiar with evidence-based practice, and you certainly are much more up to date with current imaging trends. And then obviously there's, as I mentioned, the altruistic reason of advancing this profession. The last several decades have been really good for radiology. Okay, it's been a time of rapid growth. And certainly the last few years, there have been job opportunities galore. That won't necessarily always be the way things are in radiology. It's very cyclical, as I said. But if you're somebody that's engaged with research, whether it's clinical research or educational research, that sort of puts you in the forefront of what's going on, what's new, getting out at meetings, interacting with other colleagues across the country and around the world. And that really helps you to be on the foremost of your clinical practice, even though it may be something unrelated that you're doing in research. And again, you know, radiologic science, it's not just a machine that's going to continue to propel itself forward. It's going to need people to step up and sort of be the leaders and the drivers of the new changes and the new technologies. And that includes educational technologies as well. And then in terms of quality of research, that's something that certainly over the last few decades in radiology, there's been a bit of a kind of a shift, a sea change of how research gets done. Historically, radiology research was all just descriptive, right? But there's certainly been a big increased push on quality improvement on the clinical side of things, as well as outcomes-based type research. And whether that's clinical or education, outcomes-based research is really sort of the driving force in education now. So as somebody who dabbled a little bit and continues to dabble a little bit in clinical research, what I've really found my passion for in radiology is education. And in somebody that's in academics and wanting to sort of continue to climb the ladder and grow my career trajectory, I needed to find a way to translate what I was doing in terms of education into something that's tangible in terms of publications and documenting these educational initiatives and putting them out into basically what is the discoverable realm, things that are publishable or can be seen and archived in perpetuity so that other educators and other researchers can see them. And so when we look at what is presentable in terms of what can be presented at national meetings and international meetings, and what is publishable in terms of radiology education research, it can be broken down into descriptive research, things like perspectives, opinion pieces, reviews, or data-driven education research. Now, historically, a lot of this has been survey-based, but where we've seen a big shift and something that I've been really fortunate to be a part of over the last few years is outcomes-based education research in radiology. And I think that for somebody who is interested in pursuing a career in academics, but maybe doesn't necessarily want to be a hardcore basic science researcher or somebody that's, you know, out pursuing NIH grants, I think it's totally appropriate for you to dabble in both of these, okay? I think it is absolutely acceptable, and I think it's a good thing for people to be working on perspective pieces and review articles, but you want to mix in with that stuff that's data-driven as well, because that really is going to help you in terms of your promotion and tenure packet in showing that you're becoming an established person in the community of radiology educators. Okay, so this is one of those, I guess, sort of take-home point slides, one of the important slides. This is sort of the pathway by which I work a research project from start to finish. And honestly, it doesn't matter if this is an education project or if this is, you know, something that's more of a clinical project. It all starts with the idea. Okay, we'll talk a little bit more toward the end of this talk about where we find these ideas and how do you get to them, but it all starts with an idea. Once you have that idea, the most important next step is for you to take a bit of a deep dive and do some background research. Get on PubMed, search it up, see what other folks have done in that realm, try to figure out, make yourself sort of the expert on it by reading what's been published. Excuse me. And that will end up saving you an enormous amount of time on down the road, because what you don't want to do is get super invested in a project only to realize that somebody else has already done it. There's already data on it, and you've just sort of spun your wheels and wasted your time. So do a deep dive up front, look at the background research. If you find that this is an untapped area and it's something you want to pursue, the next phase is planning. Now that planning really should be done in concert with some consultation of your mentors, your colleagues. A statistician is a great person to bring in this early planning phase, and kind of come up with your plan for your experiment. Next, you want to submit to the IRB. Just because it's education research doesn't mean that it's necessarily going to be IRB exempt. And in fact, I can speak from experience in saying that depending on what you do, if it's a topic that could invoke any controversy about it, you absolutely want to have that ironclad IRB backup behind you. And the IRB may kick it back to you and say, hey, you need to rethink some things. So this is sort of a loop in which you may have to do some reconfiguring and resubmit to IRB. But once IRB gives it the rubber stamp, then you can roll out that education intervention. And at this point, if you are ever doing any sort of a new education intervention, whether it's creating a new curriculum, trying to, tap into some novel technology for education, my strongest advice is try to find some data, try to collect some data, because having solid data that you can do some sort of analysis on, even if it's basic statistic analysis, makes it infinitely more publishable. Okay. It's like that automatically bumps it up to another level in terms of your likelihood of getting it published, is to have data instead of just being descriptive. Once you've collected that data, then you move into that assessment and analysis phase. Again, this is where I would strongly recommend having the help of a biostatistician, unless you're just somebody that has a great aptitude in math and you were a college major or minor in math, then great. I'm not one of those people, so I rely heavily on stats help. And then once you've done that analysis and that assessment, you may have to tweak some things and bring it back to the data collection phase. This is where we enter another potential loop in this cycle with reanalysis, recollection, reanalysis, improvement. It's sort of that amplification loop here. And then once you have the final data and you've done all of your analysis, don't stop there, present it. One of the greatest perks of being in academic radiology is the ability to get to travel to different places, go to different conferences, hang out with people that you've become friends with over the years, and really get as much mileage out of it in that way possible. But don't stop there. That's where I think a lot of people end up falling short. Your goal in all of this really should be to try to get it published. Not every project that you come up with, not every research project gets published, but try to make that your goal, is to seek publication. So my advice is get as much mileage as you can out of whatever academic research project you're currently doing, okay? I know this term gets thrown out a lot and is way overused, but synergy. If you're going through all of the hoops, going through all the efforts, work it all the way to completion, get all the benefits from it. All right, so let's talk about some different kinds of publishable research. And we'll start off by talking about the descriptive stuff. And the first thing would be perspectives. This is Richard Gunderman. He's a pediatric radiologist at IU. Probably many of you on this Zoom have heard him speak at RSNA or AUR. You're familiar with him from the stuff that he writes in The Atlantic. He's a guy who has built his career out of perspective pieces. He doesn't do a lot of hardcore data-driven research, but he does perspectives better than probably anybody else. And so what are perspectives? These are academic projects that really don't have any hard data. It's kind of like this is how we do it at our institution, the so-called education sermons. I think curriculum papers, if you've created a new curriculum and you want to describe it and put it in the literature, that falls into this if there's no real data to it. And careers have been made out of writing perspectives. It's difficult, but not impossible to make this the cornerstone of your career. But this is a terrific entry point into academics. And in fact, this is where I had my first entry into any sort of academic radiology. And this goes back to sort of the egoistic reasons of doing this. This was when I was a medical student, and every medical student wanting to go into radiology is encouraged, hey, you should try to do some sort of a research project and get a paper published. And this is where I first dabbled into academics and where I actually kind of fell in love with it. So I published this paper with Richard Gunderman years and years ago, and it was, kind of one of those little off-kilter Gunderman type papers in which we talked about Gestalt theory of psychology and how it applies to radiology, and looking at all of these different things that are sort of the tenets of Gestalt psychology and applying it to image interpretation. And so I found it to be really interesting. I mean, it was kind of a deep dive. It was something really outside of anything I had ever done in medicine. And it was something that, was able to get a publication in a peer-refereed journal. And it really, to me, ended up being my foot in the door to an academic career. So those are all, pros. It was a very rewarding experience. But as you're looking at prospective pieces, there are some cons, right? This is kind of the softest of soft education research. There are people who will unfortunately look down on it for lack of credibility. It's not data driven, so it's not the high and holy kind of stuff, which I think is the wrong kind of mentality. But then the other thing to keep in mind is these things are a bit more difficult to present at national meetings. It's a little bit harder to build your career on it. But as I said, these are things that I think people that want to build sort of a holistic career should dabble in. I still will occasionally write these kind of opinion pieces. This is one that that I tag teamed with Judy Gaddy and Ryan Peterson, a couple of friends of mine from different places that have really been very interested in using social media for radiology education. And so we wrote an opinion piece about that a few years ago. And really it was talking about how we've screwed up, how the three of us have screwed up royally in rolling out these cases and putting them on social media, and the risks of potential medical legal liability and potential risks for sharing protected health information. And so I think that that's the sort of thing that can actually be very valuable to want to communicate to other educators. So just because it's an opinion piece doesn't mean that it's not valuable. There are pros, right? We ended up publishing this in JACR, so it's pretty widely circulated, decent impact factor. But most importantly, it shared our kind of this communal expertise that the three of us had. But again, there are some downsides to this type of publication. It's not data driven, so there will always be a little bit of a stigma. And in this case, it was an invited manuscript. So it's great if you can get an invited manuscript on stuff, but it's a little bit harder to get some of this stuff published up front. Now, a subset of those perspectives are opinion pieces. And this is Daryl Heitkamp. Daryl's my residency program director at IU, and he's a guy who has really built his career out of writing very pointed, almost contrarian kind of opinion pieces. And he likes to, do takedowns of the ACGME and stuff like that. So the difference between this and other perspective pieces is that this really strongly conveys your personal viewpoint on a topic. This is kind of a constructive criticism, a constructive controversy. You do this with the intent of sort of stirring the pot a little bit. And I think that can be actually a very healthy thing. You should always be sort of challenging what is the dogma, whether it's of clinical medicine or of education. And so he and I and Aaron Commer, one of my neuroradiology colleagues at IU, wrote a very pointed piece about institution report turnaround times, your TATs or your RTATs, and how they're very damaging to the education mission of residency programs, and how those are actually depriving residents of the experience of being able to sort of stand on their own and develop their own autonomy during training. And so this was a very pointed opinion piece that we wrote, and it was very intentionally one-sided. We had a real motive here. These opinion pieces are good in the sense that they're oftentimes written about hot button topics, okay? Because they always carry with them that little grain of controversy. They're papers that people like to read. You'll get good engagement out of them. You can tend to get these in higher impact factor journals. But again, this sort of also falls under that realm of that soft research. It doesn't have any real data behind it. But the real take home point, the thing that I learned from this is, and I guess the mistake that we made was, boy, did we get called down to the principal's office on this one. Our department chair at the time was not real happy with us because they had concerns that we were painting our department of radiology and our residency program in a bad light by doing this. And that certainly wasn't our intent, but you can only speak from your own personal experience. And it was something that we viewed as a detriment to resident education. So what I would say is, don't be afraid of stirring up a little bit of controversy in what you do in terms of an academic career, but you do have to bear in mind that there may be consequences. You may alienate yourself from folks within your department. and you may get a little bit of a target painted on you by doing so. More recently, Chuck Maxfield, Matt Thorpe, and Lars Grimm and I did an opinion piece talking about bias in radiology and how we're all biased, how this is something that we actually all have, and that it's not something that necessarily needs to carry the shame and stigma, but rather something that in terms of radiology education, we need to be aware of. And so this was an opinion piece that was sort of also mixed in with a review of some data-driven studies that we had done. And it was really a critical review of the implicit association test. My guess is that probably many of you have taken an IAT before, especially if you're on faculty. Oftentimes they make you take these as part of your onboarding. And these are kind of these online tests that basically throw a bunch of scenarios or a bunch of words up at you, a bunch of things, and you have to sort of select things that come to mind with it. And these have been vetted by the psychology community as important tools for determining our own implicit biases. And so at any rate, what we had found in a subsequent research project looking at the IAT test was that it doesn't actually predict discrimination in terms of education against learners. Even though folks may harbor implicit biases, that knowledge of your own personal implicit bias can actually be a powerful tool for preventing you from taking the next step and translating that into a discriminating action. So again, this is an opinion piece. It was a controversial topic. But like with many of these opinion pieces, you can get those into decent impact factor journals, and people like to read these. These are always engaging studies, and this involves sort of multiple institutions as well. So those are, again, all pros of this sort of style of scholarly activity. But again, when you're dealing with opinion pieces, you're not really presenting any new data. You may be assimilating data that's already out there, but you're not presenting anything new yourself. And again, bear in mind, this is a controversial topic. You have to have some degree of thick skin if you're going to be dabbling into this kind of writing. The next part, or the next type of sort of descriptive research would be review articles and book chapters. And these are collative research. You're basically collecting and synthesizing things that others have previously published, but what you're doing is bundling that into a much more easily digested, distilled down final product. And there's probably no one who has done a better job of that in their career than Dr. Osborne, who really is kind of a legend for this sort of thing. You know, the books that she's written, the articles that she's written have really been, an excellent example of how you can make a very solid career with this as a large focus of what you do. That being said, not everybody is Dr. Osborne, right? So it may be difficult, not impossible, but it may be difficult to make this the cornerstone of your career. But what I would say for the residents and fellows that are listening in, for junior faculty, this is the absolute best way to get that extra mileage out of the education exhibits that you're submitting to your subspecialty society meetings. So if you're going to take the time to put together an education exhibit, try to go that extra step and get it published as a review article. It is still a peer-reviewed publication, and that will be beneficial to you for your career, whether it's for promotion and tenure or for just getting yourself established as an expert on a topic. And so this was this was kind of my first entry into this. Was an article that I wrote along with some colleagues in radiology and pathology at IU back when I was a resident. And this was actually kind of my spark paper. This is the thing that really got me the most interested in pursuing a career in academic radiology. And this all stemmed from a case report that I presented at ASH&R, the American Society of Head and Neck Radiology, the very first medical meeting that I ever went to. And it was one of those things where just by sort of taking that step, doing that one really basic case report, it sort of snowballed into an interest in head and neck imaging. This is truly the reason why I became a head and neck radiologist in the first place, was this, write-up of a case of schwannomatosis. And so I think that review articles are an excellent thing for residents and fellows and junior faculty to get involved with, because A, it's peer refereed, and that's always helpful. if you can get this into a reasonable impact factor journal, that's always helpful. But probably the most important thing is when you're doing this deep dive to put together a review article, you're really becoming the expert and becoming the teacher. So that's where sort of it turns this educational corner of not only have you done the deep dive, not only have you assimilated all of the stuff that others have published, but now you become the expert and you're conveying this. You're the one who's distilling this down into a vessel that future learners will be able to benefit from. And I think that these can be really fun to write. I think they're great mileage extenders for projects that you're already doing. That being said, review articles, the cons. These aren't necessarily new data that's being presented, and it's not quote unquote research. So again, the snobbery of some researchers may look down on this, but you know what, who cares? You're trying to become a holistic educator, a holistic lifelong learner. And I think that dabbling in some of this is beneficial to everyone. You can't give a talk about this sort of thing at the University of Utah without talking about Ambersis. And this is something that I kind of got involved with when I was a fellow looking for a little extra income. Harnsberger asked me if I would be willing to read a textbook and get paid to do it. And I said, sure, like win-win situation, right? And then eventually I started, doing a little bit of writing for them. And although Karen's probably going to fire me because I was so tardy this last time, but this is, to me, has been one of those things of being in the right place at the right time and not passing up on opportunities when they come your way. Okay. So, writing book chapters for promotion and tenure's sake, it probably doesn't carry a ton of weight. That doesn't mean that it's a waste of time for you as an academic radiologist, because this is, again, an opportunity, excuse me, for you to really do a deep dive and become the master of a topic. But it also helps you to improve your writing skills, your digital editing skills as you're sort of piecing these things all together and trying to present them in a beautiful manner. But also just getting your name out there and establishing a national and sort of an evolving, even international reputation as an educator. So when you're writing these book chapters, it does offer you some visibility, gives you a chance to do some personal branding, maybe a little bit of money from it in some cases, but most of the time, no. And you do get a tangible product at the end. You get a book, which, is always fun to have on yourself, I guess. But these aren't peer reviewed and it's not, research in the strictest sense. And then sort of where I think the rubber meets the road now is the data-driven research, okay? Data is at the top end of all of this, okay? It's the highest end of medical education research. And it can really be in two basic types. Historically, as I said, a lot of this was survey-based, kind of the light data, but we've seen a bigger push toward outcomes-based projects, outcomes-based education research, certainly within the radiology education community over the last 5 years. As I said, survey historically has been the biggest one, but times I think are changing. So whenever I am looking to put together an education research project that relies on survey design, I think the most important critical first step is to enlist a statistician, because they will be able to save you so many headaches on down the road and help you to set it up and help you to ask really what are the appropriate questions and what are the measurable questions. I think when you're constructing these surveys, it's important to try to collect a little more data than you're likely going to use. But keep in mind, the longer that your survey is, the lower the response rate. I mean, there is definitely a point where people are going to open it up and say, screw it, this is going to take me too long. I'm not filling out this survey. So when you're putting together a survey, there's things you want to think about. You want to think about the demographics of who you're surveying. Are they representative of radiology and are they representative of educators and learners? Are you being diverse? Are you only surveying people who look like you and think like you, or are you being much more inclusive of what radiology actually looks like in the backgrounds of learners? You do want to avoid leading questions. Okay, your job here is not to con people into answering things the way that you want them to answer. You want to know what is the truth. I think when you're coming up with surveys, it's always best to try to make as many discrete choices as possible. Make them dial down and select A, B, or C rather than something that's nebulous and write in a response, because those can be a lot harder to try to do data analysis on. And then you want to review it and review it and review it, have your statistician review it, have your colleagues review it before you ever roll it out, because you only get one shot, right? It's like a Derringer. You get one shot. You can't just send the survey out and say, oh, I messed it up. Sorry, forget it. Let me send another one out. Thanks for taking the time to fill this out. I just need you to do it again, because people aren't going to do that. And so this was sort of my first dabbling into using surveys. And this was something that I don't honestly even know how I got interested in the first place, because I wasn't really on social media. But I thought, hey, this might be an interesting tool for trying to augment the radiology learning process. But I was curious, like, would people even find this to be something that they would want to use for radiology education? And would there be generational differences? Would faculty view it differently than trainees? Would older faculty view it differently than younger trainees? And so really what I wanted to know is, were radiologists using social media? And if so, had they used it for education, and would they be willing to join it for education? And so I sent out a survey to, I think we had 172 radiologists in our department at that time. I stratified them by their academic rank, what their generation was, whether they were boomers versus Gen X versus millennials. And by doing that, I was able to actually do some pretty simple statistical analysis and try to figure out, exactly who was using social media and who would be interested in using it for educational purposes. And no surprise, we found that there were statistically significant generation gaps, not just in who uses it, but how it was being used. So when you're doing a survey like this, the data is really pretty easily collected. You can set it up so that data analysis is easy, and it can be relatively easy to publish. And there are great tools like Qualtrics and SurveyMonkey that can make this really pretty simple. And I think what's nice about this is, as you're trying to develop some sort of educational curriculum, this is a great way to accumulate data pretty quickly and get a sense for what you need to do and what the interest is. Now, the downsides of using surveys are, in terms of evidence-based pyramid, it's pretty low, right? And more importantly, the data is only as good as the survey that you craft, right? If you create a junky survey, you're going to get junk as a response. So, this is just to really quickly march you through the kinds of questions that we asked in the survey. And again, these are discrete choices. That makes your statistical analysis so much easier. So you query their age, and don't just say input your age, give them like decades, okay? That way you can break it down quickly. Same with level of training. Very binary. Would you find an electronic radiology case of the day to be valuable? Yes or no? How much time would you be willing to spend on it? The types of platforms that they would be willing to consider using, what kind of social media they currently are using. Get some really interesting ones when they filled in the other. More radiologists using Tinder than I thought. But and then how much time did they currently spend on it? Have they used it for education in the past? Would they be willing to join social media for educational activities? And then the sorts of tools that they thought would be useful for rolling out some sort of new case-based educational format. And so you can take that data and, using Excel, very easily break it up and triage it by, trainees, faculty, their different generations. In this case, I binned millennials and Gen X together because they tended to cluster together with the same sort of responses we were getting versus our boomers in orange. And we ended up finding that there were very statistically significant differences in who was on social media, how much time they were using it, and whether or not they thought it would be useful for education. So again, just to rehash kind of what I said already, finding a good statistician is going to be your best friend, regardless of what sort of data-driven education project you're doing. The problem is statisticians don't work for free, right? So if your department chair really values your promotion and tenure, your development as a radiology educator, they're going to be interested in investing in you. And so what that may mean is upfront is they, ask them for some funding to help you with statistical analysis before, at least until you can get sort of your own war chest of your discretionary funds together, that you can pay for this on your own. And I think that if you're in a place where your department leadership really values promotion and tenure, this is a reasonable ask. It's really a drop in the bucket compared to your operating budget for your department. The other thing is, I hear a lot of places say, "Oh, well, I'm not gonna fund your statistician, but I'll pay for you to go to a course to learn how to do stats." Well, I mean, I think that's fine, but that might work if you're only a researcher but you're a diagnostic radiologist or an interventional radiologist, you only have so much bandwidth. And to me, I would say that it's more appropriate to have a statistician who knows this, whose job this is to do this kind of stuff, looking at the data and hammering it out, rather than having you try to fake it till you make it, to try to make it work. Because frankly, if you're not a mathematician, you're going to make errors. And what you don't want to do is have to have a paper redacted or taken down because you've got some sort of statistical error that gets figured out later on. So I think that a department that values you is going to really want to work with you and help you out. And as junior faculty, this, I think, is a reasonable ask to come to your chair, to come to your administration with. So this was another example of just a way that you can use outcomes-based education. This was a really simple project that I did as a resident. And that's to actually assess learning, which I know sounds simple, but in reality, assessing learning is probably the hardest thing that we can try to do and try to publish statistics on. But this was just looking at a resident as teacher project that I had to do as a resident. And like I said, if you're going to go through all of the hoops to do a new curriculum, do some sort of new education intervention for your department, collect data on it, because that makes it infinitely publishable. So this was a radiation safety and radiobiology lecture series that I started giving when I was a resident as part of my required resident as teacher project. And so since I was, rolling out these new lectures, I thought, hey, I'll just do a pre-test, the lecture series, a post-test, and a survey. And that way you can actually assess the learnings as well as perceptions about the educational process. And so this was, my first dabbling at an outcomes-based study, and it was some of the pros of this was it was peer reviewed. It definitely directly assessed learning by comparing pre and post-test scores. It was a pretty simple design. You give a pre-test, you give a couple lectures, you give a post-test at the end of the clerkship, and you see how they did and see if they improved. And that makes for pretty easy statistics to compare pre and post like that. But again, this is, one of those cases where the data is really only as good as the tool you use to assess it. And important to keep in mind that this is a single institution cohort. So what works for residents or fellows at your institution may not work well for residents and fellows at another institution. So you have to be careful about generalizing your results to everybody. You can really only present it as, this is how it worked for my cohort. Here's another project that, kind of came out of it as a bit of a passion project in terms of finding data in unlikely places. But unlikely, it really was actually finding data in a super obvious place. And so when I was a resident, I helped put together this academic and research track for the residents, in which residents who were part of it would end up getting some protected academic time to work on research projects, so long as they had a well thought out project and mentor and stuff. And so we started this at IU back in 2012, and it exists today. I served as the faculty liaison for a few years when I came on faculty. And so, there were really only a handful of places that had really done this sort of thing across the country. And it's one of those cases of wanting to get as much mileage out of a project as possible. And I thought, well, maybe I should write a curriculum paper about this and describe what we did. But as I said, you can do those curriculum papers as perspective pieces, but the way you can make things way more easily publishable is to have data. And so this was an example of finding data in, places that maybe aren't typically tapped locations. And so what we did is we were able to get this study published in a peer-reviewed journal. And what we did is we looked at all of our residents from 2007 through 2018, and we broke them down by those who were in the academic and research track versus those who were not. And then we were able to track what kind of careers they went into, whether or not they went into academics or private practice. And we were also able to look at PubMed and Google Scholar and find the total number of publications, total number of first author publications, total number of senior author publications, and can then compare pre-intervention to post-intervention. So residents who were pre-academic and research track versus those who came in after that intervention was established. as well as comparing those who went into academics that were in the ART versus those who were not, to see whether or not being in this curriculum improved your likelihood of finding a job in academic radiology and whether it made you more likely to be published. And so this was a true outcome study, and we were able to do a little bit more complicated statistics, nothing too crazy, chi-square and Poisson regression. But again, this is a case of the data is only as good as the tool that you use to assess it. And again, this is a single institution cohort. But the real learning point here on this is if you're going to go and create a new curriculum, collect data on it and look for data in places where others have not, because data is what makes things infinitely more publishable. So kind of think outside of the box of what historically has been published data, and that may actually help drive you to find what kind of research project you're going to do. Kind of an example of that was carrying forward from that that look we took into using social media was we took it another step further. And after we found that people were interested in using social media for radiology education, we came up with a curriculum. It was a weekly education initiative out of IU, in which we did a case-based learning module. We put it out on social media as well as emailed it to the whole department. And we had folks interact with it on Twitter. And by using those publicly available Twitter analytics tools, was able to look at its utilization, as well as YouTube, look at the YouTube viewership of many lectures that were part of this curriculum, as well as to do a survey of our learners. So this was finding data in sort of an untapped location. Not a lot of people, to my knowledge at that point, or even subsequent to that, have used analytics of social media to sort of comment on utilization of educational resources. And so this is an example of using just simply data that's out there that is kind of at anybody's fingertips, and then applying it to your educational goals. And so this was an outcomes-based study. It was peer refereed. It truly was low-hanging fruit, okay? Nobody was really looking at this kind of stuff. And that's really all that it takes in a lot of these projects, is to figure out what data is out there and then sort of create a project based upon it. Some of the cons of doing this, we were able to look at Twitter case impressions and case engagements, as well as YouTube utilization. So we could very nicely comment on these increased trends in utilization, but it doesn't directly assess learning, which, as I said before, is always sort of the challenge and sort of the holy grail of any sort of educational research. And then the other thing that sort of implicit in this is that just because people were using it doesn't necessarily mean that they valued it. We kind of infer that people who use these things find it valuable. But the next step in doing something like that was a paper that I published along with a lot of other authors, including Rick Wiggins here, very recently at the end of December. Was we took that sort of that social media based education initiative, and we blew it up to an even bigger scale through a national society, which was the American Society of Head and Neck Radiology. And we published this just a couple months ago in AJNR. And so this was really kind of a mixed purpose and a data-driven paper in which we used it to describe a new curriculum. But like I said before, if you're going to be describing a new curriculum, take some data with you and do some analysis of the data. That's going to make it infinitely more publishable than just making an opinion piece and saying, this is what we did. Instead, this is what we did. These were the outcomes. And so the thing that that sort of, I don't know if fortuitously is the right word for it. This COVID-19 pandemic was horrific, but in the midst of all of this gamified social media-based radiology education initiative of the ASHNR, about 18 months into it, COVID-19 hits. And so we were able to look at our utilization of social media for radiology education pre-COVID-19 versus post-COVID-19 pandemic, and look for differences in the utilization rates. And then we're also able to document really what the global outreach of one of these educational initiatives is by using, Twitter functionality and some marketing platform tools. So again, I think this is an example of look for that low-hanging fruit of data. That's what makes things publishable, is having data. So if you can tap a previously untapped data source, you can get a lot of mileage and a lot of papers out of it. And really, this was kind of a passion project for me. This is something that I invested a lot of time in over the last several years. And so working a project all the way to that completion of publication really should be your goal. And you're going to feel a lot of personal reward and satisfaction in doing that. So for those of you that aren't familiar with kind of the concept of this ASH&R case of the week, what we do is every Wednesday we roll out a new unknown case. We post this on Twitter. It's a slide that has a couple salient images and a history, in this case, a lump that just won't go away. And what we do is we ask for Twitter users to engage us, send us a response that hints at the answer without giving it away. Because if somebody just says, oh, this is a levator claviculae muscle, everybody who's on social media knows the answer and it ruins it for everybody. So instead, we encourage people to submit GIFs, animated GIFs. So it's interesting because it sort of makes you think about the response. It makes you come up with one of these GIFs that sort of encapsulates the response. And it sort of weaves this tapestry of putting together some sort of a flashbulb episodic memory to tie in with this semantic memory of the actual diagnosis. And then the next day we put out the answer, annotated what the answer is. So our theory here is that people are going to be much more interested in interacting with this because we've now gamified it. We've made this a more enjoyable learning tool, but we also make you take another step forward and think about it in a different manner and try to apply a different sort of like a guidepost reference to it, which in this case is a GIF image, something that will stick with you. And hopefully in the future, when you see this on imaging, you'll think of Elmo shrugging his shoulders and you'll think, oh, okay, I've seen this diagnosis before. I remember this GIF. That's going to help my learning. So this was an outcomes-based study. Again, it was a study that was, I think, kind of low-hanging fruit in terms of the data, but it was using sort of this novel application and really had some real-world value. Again, problems being that we didn't really assess their learning, and we assumed that just because people were utilizing it means that they valued it. I think that's probably the case, but one of those unknowables. So this all kind of comes down to me that, you're going to start chasing these rabbits and you don't know where they're going to take you, but just chase the rabbit for a while and see where it goes. This happened to me whenever I was asked by Chuck Maxfield, who's a pediatric radiologist at Duke several years ago, if I'd be willing to kind of join a cohort with about 4 other institutions and try to come up with a conglomerate of researchers in medical education that could sort of bin our data across multiple institutions to really do data-driven education research in the radiology realm. And so our first paper was to do this multi-institution audit study of academic radiology departments. And what we did is we created a deceptive study. We tricked faculty at all of our institutions into thinking that they were reviewing real ERAS applications of potential residency candidates. And we had them score them as to whether or not they wanted to offer them an interview based upon several variables, like their step 1 score, their grades, their number of publications. But we also put an image in, a picture of this hypothetical candidate or this fictitious candidate. These were not real applicants. These were all fake, but we didn't tell the reviewers that. We had them review them as though they were real candidates. And what we were able to do was, by using some kind of fancy statistics, using some linear mixed effects modeling, we were able to look at over 5,000 unique applications and assess for bias and discrimination. And what we found was that whenever you allowed for or normalized it for number of publications, GPA, AOA status, all that, we found that people were not intentionally biasing against unattractive and obese applicants. And so this actually got picked up by the national media. It created a little bit of buzz, and it was a bit controversial. I made some enemies. There are people in my department to this day that don't talk to me because I tricked them into reviewing these candidates. Now, this obviously with a deceptive study has ethical considerations. We had to have an airtight IRB approval for this. It required some complicated statistics. Now, kind of the follow-up to that was we were then able to ask those people on down the road if they would complete the IAT for race and weight bias, and then survey them about whether or not they had previously had any prior bias training about these things. And we were able to compare their IAT scores with how they rated applicants on that deception study. And interestingly, what we found was that the implicit association test, these tests that we all take for onboarding and to determine what our biases are, they may be very useful in finding what our own implicit biases are, but we were able to show that they don't actually predict discriminatory behavior, which to me is kind of the silver lining in all of this. We all have these implicit biases, and as educators, we have implicit biases, but just the sheer fact that you know about those biases will actually allow you to help to compensate for that and to make sure that you don't take that to the detrimental next step, which is discriminatory behavior. So this was an audit study, and we were able to publish this in a non-radiology medical education journal, so with very high impact factor. But really, to me, the most important thing that came out of this was this task group that we created on resident education resources. So whenever you're doing this kind of study, just keep in mind that there are ethical considerations. Whenever you're dealing with things that are controversial topics, you may make enemies, and then you just have to, you have to know that, and you have to keep in mind that what you're doing is going to be of the benefit of residents and fellows and learners, and hopefully in preventing discriminatory behavior in the educational process. So my next advice that ties along with that is, as you're doing this, as you're walking this pathway, it is critically important to find a strong mentor, a good mentor, someone who's looking out for you, as well as to find your posse. Okay. And so I've found this. Rick has been like the best friend and mentor that a person could ever have in academic medicine and in life in general. And, it's I credit almost all of my successes to things that I've learned from him. And, to the point he's probably sick of getting texts from me and bouncing ideas off of him about education stuff. And then, find your posse. These are folks that are all sort of in this radiology education circle that I've gotten to know through AUR and RSNA over the years. Not a day goes by that I don't end up calling or texting or messaging these people multiple times to run ideas about education and education research off of them, and, just life stuff in general. And so sort of this expanding posse is this Radiology Residency Education Research Alliance, which now has about 48 members, I think, that started out just 5 of us with that initial deception study. Now we've grown it to include numerous institutions, radiology programs across the country, both university programs and community-based practice. And it's allowed us to do really some very high-end evidence-based papers and research projects by being able to bend together data from multiple sources, including University of Utah. Megan Mills is sort of the faculty liaison for the RRERA here at the U. And so we've been able to do things that really sort of far exceed the historical, kind of survey stuff, in doing things like this implicit association testing and audit studies, but more recently, discrete choice experiments and forced choice experiments that we've had success in finding publication with. If this is something that as a faculty member, or even as a resident or fellow, you're more interested in, you can follow this QR code and learn a little bit more about the RRERA. I think in terms of getting off the ground with this, the hardest part is usually finding your idea. Sometimes it just comes to you. I've had ideas that have come to me while I've been out running or, in the shower or whatever, but usually it takes some introspection. I think as an educator, really the 2 best ways to find your idea are to think about the things that you're most passionate about, because if you're passionate about it, you're more likely to work that project all the way to completion. Or if it's something that really grinds your gears and annoys you, and something that you think that you're not doing well as an educator in an area where you think you can potentially find quality improvement. This is also an important area where mentors come in, and again, bouncing ideas off of your friends and colleagues. But as I've said before multiple times in this talk, I'll say it again. Really, I think that one of the best things that you can do is to think about potential data sources. Because once you find that data source, the education research ideas really just start to flow. And then in terms of finding your allies, this is an area where you really need to network. And I think that there are some meetings, some medical society and medical imaging meetings that are really good for this. If you're interested in radiology education, you need to be going to the AUR meeting every year. RSNA is another good one as well, but even subspecialty society meetings. I'm very involved with the ASH&R, and I think that that society in particular is phenomenal about educational endeavors and initiatives, and you'll find like-minded people there that you can collaborate with. I think it's helpful to sit through the scientific sessions, even if they're not education-based, because it helps you to think about projects, and approaching education projects with the same sort of approach that you would approach a clinical research project, I think really can help you in terms of finding good data to present. You obviously need allies in department leadership, but also in your interdisciplinary colleagues. I interact very highly with our head and neck oncologic surgeons at IU, and so being able to team up with them for educational related stuff is really important as well. And then pay it forward, be an ally yourself. This is something that you never are able to achieve your successes on your own. You're always reliant on other people, and I think it's important to pay that forward as well. And then the last thing I'll say is, when it all comes to the end, your goal is publication, right? So if you're in the education research realm, the so-called premier radiology journals, you know what I'm talking about, like Radiology and even AJR, may not always be the best fit. Now, if it's a big data-driven project, radiology might consider it, but most of the time they won't. And that's okay. You need to know to target to the right journal. There are some journals that are much better about publishing education-related stuff. And keep in mind the readership. The readership of academic radiology are radiology educators. That's your target population, okay? Just because it's not as high of an impact factor doesn't mean that that's not important, because the impact that it will have on the people that matter will be the highest in a journal like that. And then JACR under Ruth Carlos has been phenomenal about trying to bolster its outreach into publishing data-driven education topics as well. And then lastly, look outside of radiology education as well. There are a lot of really high impact medical education journals. And honestly, radiology education is medical education, is education. And so the things that you do as a radiologist in terms of education may be highly applicable to other specialties as well. So do think about publishing outside. So in summary, radiology research, education research, it certainly has been richly rewarding in my career, but it's not without challenges. My advice to you is, anytime you're doing something new, if it's something your department asks you to head up, if it's something you're doing just because you're interested in it, get as much mileage out of it as possible. Your goal really should be to try to publish as much of this stuff as you can. It's really critical to find a good mentor and allies and colleagues. And as I said, reviews, book chapters, perspective pieces, I think those are all highly valuable. I'm not here to poo-poo on those and talk down on them. I think that it makes you a better educator to have that holistic approach. But do keep in mind that data-driven scholarship reigns supreme and certainly makes things much more publishable. But in the end, there are multiple pathways to success. This has been the pathway that I've walked so far, and I've had some pretty decent results most of the time with. But what works for me may not work for you. That's where developing those relationships with colleagues at other institutions and a good mentor will really be incredibly helpful for you as you try to go down this process yourself. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that folks have.
That is very impressive, Dr. Koontz. Thank you so much. I'm really happy that Dr. Anzai wanted you to come and talk to us about this. It's a big deal. I do want to highlight and emphasize, just for the audience, a couple of things that I think Dr. Koontz has done that is significant over his relatively early career. It's impressive that he's already done so much. One is just the data use that he talked about. When we think about the levels of evidence of research, there's not a lot outside of interventional, certainly, of level 1 prospective randomized clinical trials. A lot of it is level 4 or 5 case reports and case series in radiology literature. But Dr. Koontz has done an amazing job at looking at this data in a different way and turning it into something significant. Those opinion pieces and stuff, as he said, some of these you're getting a lot of traction on, on the internet, on social media, the news media picking up. sometimes the lectures that really elicit a strong reaction from the audience are the most exciting that we talk about. Another thing is social media and scholarship. Increasingly over the past 20 years or so that I've been writing rec letters, we used to just focus on how many times are you the PI on a grant and how many first author publications or last author publications, and is this a peer-reviewed literature now? But increasingly, social media use is something. If you imagine putting something on the internet, you're reaching a lot of people. It turns out there are a lot of people on the internet. So social media used, as he says, transforming that educational stuff into scholarship is seeing something that more and more we're seeing. There are a lot of people who are getting promoted based on these social media posts and YouTube videos and something like that. Another big significant thing I think that a lot of people don't recognize, for a lot of medical societies, the 1-year annual meeting is pretty much it. You have this one meeting and that's it. And until next year's meeting, there's really nothing going on. Dr. Koontz has really amazingly and impressively well found a way with social media to continue the educational efforts throughout the year. So the ASH&R, as he said, is a great example. It's not just the one meeting every year and maybe a couple of videos that are recorded or put on the website as archivable content. But Dr. Koontz has really found an impressive way to continue the educational efforts throughout the year. It's not just the one-time annual meeting anymore that we have a conference and that talk is over. He's done a very impressive job at continuing education. So everybody's learning throughout the year with the society. It's not the annual meeting. Let's see it. So I'll look at, I just wanted to highlight those aspects. I think that he didn't impress enough maybe on the audience about what he's done and how impressive it really is. I don't see anything in the chat. Dr. Osborne mentioned in the QA, thank you for your kind words, Nick. I have one suggestion for young rads, residents, fellows, and junior faculty. If you see a cool case and thinking about writing a case report, think of ways you can turn a case report into a paper. It only takes 3 or 4 to make it worth publishing. Yeah, anytime you can take a single case and maybe search with Empower through the reports to try to turn that into a case series is a much more attractive thing. And there are some journals like the H&R who won't even look at case reports anymore, and increasingly won't even look at case series. You have to have at least 5 of something kind of past proven in that world to even think about publishing it. There are a lot of different journals and predatory journals. Depending on where you end up in academia, they may not care if it's a peer-reviewed journal. They may care that it's a peer-reviewed journal. They may want to know the impact factor of that journal when you're thinking about your efforts and turning them into scholarship credit. That becomes important. So that's certainly right. Thank you, Dr. Osborne.
Yeah, I think one comment on that also is that's an area where, as you're networking with other folks and going to national meetings and kind of finding your posse, that is a great resource for being able to put together that case series and turning what is sort of small data on your end to rapidly expanding that to making it something publishable by binning data from multiple sites. So I can't stress enough how important it is to get out there and interact, go to meetings, make friends, sit through sessions, socialize, get drinks with folks at national meetings. Don't just hole yourself up in a hotel like a hermit. That's part of all of this. And honestly, the stuff that is the most enjoyable is the social aspect of this as well. So maybe it's justification for socializing.
A lot of the conferences, the curbside discussions out in the hallway is sometimes the biggest thing to helping your career. That if you have 4 friends who all have one case of something, together you have a case series, that's something publishable. That's certainly right. I think there was another comment. Dr. Quigley mentioned for residents and fellows how to best avoid seeming non-predatory journals that actually are. Avoid the pay to publish journals. That's totally a thing. In some places, that's perfectly okay. And publishing in predatory journals at some academic sites is totally a fine thing. Sometimes it's not obvious. You get an email asking you to submit something to their journal, and it's not until you submit it that they ask for $4,000 to actually go publish that thing. So it's not always an easy thing to avoid. Have you had experience with that, Dr. Koontz, predatory journals and conferences?
Yeah, I would say that on a daily basis, you get emails, I feel like, of something that just seems too good to be true and seems suspicious. I also get a lot of invitations to speak at some international cannabis conference. I'm not sure what that's about, but yeah, you do get these all the time, and they all sound great. But honestly, if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. And so, you know, going with the tried and true same handful of journals is probably your best bet. There are some other things as well. You know, like I think Curious is one of those journals that's sort of more open access, and I don't know if that's pay to play or not, but I see that a lot more. I think it's probably more reputable. And there are other repositories, especially in medical education as well. I know that actually through the University of Utah, and I'm having a brain fart here, the Optho Clinic, they actually have a big sort of repository of educational stuff that people can submit to, and it gets indexed that you can put sort of case-based materials and learning cases up that way as well. And I have seen people in radiology submit that as part of P&T packages. But I think in general, the stuff that carries the absolute most amount of weight would be traditional peer refereed articles, and book chapters as well. Like they don't carry as much weight for promotion as peer refereed publications, but I can't imagine there are too many places that say no, they count for nothing. And like I said, it may not carry as much weight for promotion and tenure, but it does carry a lot of weight for getting your name out there and sort of establishing your reputation as an expert in the field.
And that certainly depends on the site. There are some academic sites where it's a bigger deal than others that they may not. And predatory journals as well as predatory conferences is an odd thing in our world. I've had people email me about conferences, and I said, I have no idea what you're talking about. And they sent me the link, and they've got my picture and my name and that I'm talking about something, but I have no idea what that conference is or anything about it. So this is totally a real but strange thing in our world. And it's something we want to be aware of and talk about it.
Yeah, when I first came on faculty at IU, one of the abdominal imagers gave me the advice of no journal that's asking you to pay for publication is worth submitting to ever, period. That being said, a lot of these journals, even the reputable ones, I feel like are a bit shady in that they are telling you need to add this, that, or whatever to your paper, and oh, that puts you over the character or word count limit. Now you have to pay this extra money, or pay for color prints or pay for open access. Even the main journals are a little bit predatory in how they're operating these days.
It's all digital. If you add 3 words, how much more are those ones and zeros that you're adding onto it? That's totally true. Let's see, I think we have nothing else in the chat or the QA. So I guess we'll wrap that up. Thank you so much, Dr. Koontz, for joining us for the grand rounds. Thank you, Dr. Anzai, for letting me guest moderate for you being out of town. And we're really excited about this. Hopefully recorded okay if the people who missed it can watch it later. Remember to call in for your CME credit. And we certainly look forward to watching your career continue to grow in the future, Dr. Koontz. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thanks for the invite. Always great to catch back up, and I'll see you guys here in a few weeks for the Head and Neck Conference.
Yep. Looking forward to it. Thank you so much, guys. Thanks for coming today. Have a good day.